How's everybody doing? So I'm very happy to welcome you all to the business school. It's always a thrill for me to get to talk about China, and in particular in today's day and age, to put together a discussion about China and the business opportunities and the growth opportunities and all of that stuff inside of a business school context is wonderful. But it's also wonderful in Washington, D.C. to link those kind of conversations with the intersection of business and politics and really think deeply about what U.S.-China relations means for thinking about the role of China in the global economy, the role of the United States in the global economy and how it's changing, and the intersection of the two largest economies in the world and what it actually means. It's particularly interesting to be giving that discussion in the shadow of Xi Jinping's visit here. And so it's really a wonderful moment for me to welcome you all here, and I'm very happy to have you. I'm a business school dean, and so I'm used to being interrupted all the time. It's sort of the standard of how we kind of give talks in business schools. It's a little bit different than the arts and sciences environment. And so if you have questions or comments or concerns about some line of reasoning that we're going on, feel free to raise your hand and pipe in, and I'll be happy to address it. I may say to you, I'm going to get to that in a few minutes, so if you'll hold tight, we'll get there. But it'll I think, allow people to feel engaged with what we're doing as we're going along. I'm going to try to leave a little bit of time at the end for some comments and questions, but I'm going to have to really run at 7, so we're going to have to make sure that we get everything in by then. And if we don't get through all my slides, that's okay too. So what is it that we're here to talk about today? This is a story that people know very well. We've watched over the course of the last 30-plus years the most populous nation on earth that was an economy on the verge of bankruptcy in the period of 1976 to 1979. Rise out of the ashes and have the most stunning economic development story of any large nation that we've ever seen. Now, if you know anything about economic development, it's sometimes the case that smaller nations are able to have this kind of pace. So in the 1980s and 90s, Botswana was the great case of Africa, right? And so Botswana had double-digit growth, and it was sort of an amazing story. It's very rare that a country this size is able to sustain double-digit economic growth the way China did in the 1980s and the 1990s. And today, we think of China as being on the brink of some kind of recession that's going to shake the global economy. But to put that in context, we're talking about China dropping from 8% projected growth rate to 7 or 6, right? And in the United States, we're wondering whether the U.S. GDP is going to grow at 0.5% or 1%. Right, so this is still an amazing story even today. And of course, the other story that we worry about is sometime around 2016, China is going to surpass the United States in terms of the overall size of the economy. Now, of course, that's not in terms of per capita GDP. The U.S. is still a much larger economy. But in terms of overall size, that's where we're headed. And barring some kind of catastrophic political situation, that's where we're going to end up. And this has actually created a lot of anxiety in the United States, which I'm going to talk about. But just to take a step back for a second, first of all, how many have been to China? Okay. So you may know that, for those of you who have been there, that this is not really what we're talking about. I mean, this is what we know in terms of numbers, but what we're really talking about is this. We're talking about and I always like to show this picture. Anybody recognize this picture? Okay, it's Shanghai, and in particular, it's standing on the Bund, looking out over Pudong, right? In the mid-1990s, Pudong was nothing but a set of broken down factories and rice fields, and there was nothing really there. You'd stand on the Bund, except the TV tower was there, but you'd stand on the Bund and look out over, and you wouldn't see much. Right? And so in 15 years, this has changed into a futuristic landscape in which if you stand here, this probably is about the view from, if you go to Shanghai and you want to experience a great nouveau riche kind of experience, you'll go to a restaurant called M on the Bund. Right? And M on the Bund has this beautiful patio that this picture was probably taken from. And you'll look out and you'll see these strobing lights in this futuristic city. This was built in a 15-year period. This is unbelievable. This is so far beyond expectations and understanding of what can happen in global economic development that we're still kind of reeling from understanding it. And so whenever I talk to executives who have a mindset about what's going on in China and what's right and what's wrong, my first question is always, have you been to China? And some say yes, some say no. And then my second point is, you got to go. You just have to, before you talk to me anymore, go to China, and then we'll talk, and then we'll figure out what it is that you're thinking about or what you're worried about. But you have to go, because it's a very different thing. And I'll say that to all of you. Take the opportunity when you get it. Now, I'm a social scientist by training. My PhD is actually in sociology, and I like to think about the social construct and the social context of markets and business and the ways in which business emerges out of a number of different forces that aren't just reducible to market efficiency theory. So I'd like to talk a little bit about history as we go through this. Right? China has been viewed through many different lenses over the course of the last couple of centuries. It was for many years, over a millennium ago, it was a place that some people got an idea that we have so many barbarians outside of our highly civilized nation, we should build a wall around ourselves and push everybody out to the north and the west. It's also been a place that was highly agricultural. It was a place where the Western encroachment with China, starting in around the end of the Ming Dynasty, created a tremendous amount of cultural clash. And this was a cultural clash between the emergent West, which was becoming powerful, but still was not anywhere near China's economic and political power in the late Ming period. And so this created a tremendous amount of tension between our two parts of the globe that have had huge influences that we even feel today. And so I always also exhort people to study a little bit of Chinese history. It's great to study the economics, but understand what happened in times like the Opium Wars. If you want to understand what the power of Mao's image was when he came to power in 1949, you have to understand the Opium Wars and what those time periods actually meant in terms of the Western encroachment and what the experience was for China. Right? So that kind of history was important. But eventually we see China emerge into communist China, but we've seen over the course of 60 years of Communist Party rule the transformation from a truly kind of guerrilla warfare-led regime under Mao Zedong to a very different kind of regime and a very different set of images for what communism is today. This final picture, actually, I took in 2007 in Lijiang, which is a town in Yunnan province. And if you'll notice, it's a replica of Mao's ascension to the pinnacle of power in communist China in 1949. But this domestic multinational called Geely, which is producing automobiles that want to be competitive with the likes of Mercedes and Toyota, has set up an expo right under the blessing hand of Mao's outstretched vision. And so it's a very interesting moment to kind of think about what it is that is the mixture of communism and capitalism today. I often start my writings and my talks about China saying something that comes out of this picture. The greatest irony of our time is that the largest communist society in the world is also the most dynamic capitalist economy in the world. What does that mean? How can that even be true? Right? And furthermore, is it true that there are more dynamic and more business-friendly economy than the United States, which should be the pinnacle of capitalism, right? At least we've always believed that. And I would argue that today, actually, yes, it is true. And so we have a lot to think about and a lot to learn. Now, continuing with our historical voyage or historical progression, this story really starts in 1979. Who's this guy? Deng Xiaoping. 1979, Deng Xiaoping has just won his way to power. It looked like Hua Guofeng was actually going to be the successor to Mao Zedong. And Deng Xiaoping outmaneuvered him. And he got control of China. The first thing he does, January 1, 1979, he gets on a plane and he visits Washington, D.C. and 3 other places in the United States. He visits Seattle, Atlanta, and Houston. Why Atlanta? What do you know that is in Atlanta? Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola. Deng Xiaoping had the insight. Remember, Deng Xiaoping is famous for having said, I don't care if the cat is black or white, I care whether it catches mice. Right? Which it means, essentially, is a very veiled way of saying, I don't really care about communism, capitalism. I care about whether or not we win. Right? So I better figure out what these global multinationals are doing, and if we are going to have a dominant economy, we better have a very good consumer-based economy. And what's the biggest consumer brand in the world? I better go visit Coca-Cola. Now, why Seattle? Too early for Microsoft. Boeing. Why Boeing? Why is that important? Technology, right? It's the other end of a spectrum, right? Coca-Cola, even though they make a lot about this special intellectual property rights of their syrup, it's a pretty simple production process. But making airplanes, my goodness, if you're going to actually build an economy that's going to be a powerful economy, you better have a high-tech manufacturing sector, and airplanes are about as high-end as you get in terms of that complexity, right? So we need these two companies to come. Now, it turns out that Boeing and Coke would be the first two companies that would sign joint venture deals under the new joint venture law that was passed on January 1, 1979. So you could see what Deng Xiaoping was doing. Why Houston? No. Space. NASA. Right? And 2 years ago, China launched its first rocket, which showed its power as an emerging global economic superpower, which was not just about economic power, but how you use that economic power to then build a navy, build an aerospace system, build everything else that massive geopolitical powers around the world have. Right? And so Deng Xiaoping was an amazing mind in this entire thing. Of course, this was a forgotten moment. Most people won't recognize this person or this time. This picture was taken on September 17, 2001. Now, we had other things on our mind at that time, and so most people was kind of buried somewhere in the first section of the New York Times. But what was happening at that moment? Anybody? China's accession to the WTO. Right? So the United States had actually worked very hard since 1989 to keep China out of the WTO. Now, most people in the U.S. political system wouldn't say that that was actually what they were doing, but that is what they were doing. We've made lots of arguments about China in terms of human rights and in terms of where they are on social systems, but the bare bones, the underlying principles of the dynamic between China and the United States since 1989 has been a desire to keep China in check economically. Right? And so finally, in 2001, after basically 10 years of lobbying and Zhu Rongji coming to China or to the United States to get a deal for WTO accession in July of 1999 and failing, and then Jiang Zemin coming back in November of 1999, they got a deal, and then the session happens in 2001, and since then the world has never been the same. Basically, the handcuffs were off. The leash was off, like it was time to go. And anybody who was advising companies or studying China during that time, you can see from 2001 to 2003, like the world just exploded. And so we've actually really been witnessing that transformation. And of course, that transformation in some way culminated for many people in the greatest coming out story we'd ever seen. The 2008 Olympics was just this unbelievable moment, this unbelievable opportunity to see what China was capable of. Interestingly, in terms of politics, I think most people don't know the political backstory of even that event. Everybody who watched the Olympics, which is a lot of people, maybe not everybody, but most people, saw the dramatic success of it and the fact that it had been something that the world had never, ever seen in terms of the scale of production and the perfection of production. Steven Spielberg was actually supposed to be the executive producer of this entire thing. He was supposed to be the person who kind of did what he did for movies for the Beijing Olympics. Does anybody know who actually ended up producing it? Zhang Yimou. Why is Zhang Yimou significant? He's one of the greatest directors and producers in China, famous for movies like Raise the Red Lantern, Red Sorghum, and a movie called To Live. But the interesting thing also about Zhang Yimou, and why I think it's an interesting footnote politically, is that after To Live, which if you haven't seen, you should see it. It's my favorite epic Chinese film of all time. It's just a beautiful, beautiful movie. But the interesting thing is he wasn't officially exiled, but he was really persona non grata amongst the Communist Party in China after the production of that film, because it's a very, very scathing critique of the Cultural Revolution period. So the fact that the Chinese government kind of saw past that and decided to invite him back to be the architect of this amazing production sort of tells you just how much China is willing to think pragmatically about where they are and how much they're willing to set aside ideological warfare to actually do what they want to do for the country. And so it just is an amazing moment historically to think about. Despite that, or in the context of that, or as a competing image of that, we still hear all the time about the woes of China. We hear about how this is a house of cards. It's so corrupt that you can't get anything done there. We hear about the amazing problems in terms of labor and human rights. We hear about the amazing problems in terms of pollution. We hear about the amazing problem in terms of the trade imbalance. Right? We also hear about the amazing problems on a political front. Images that still are burned in our minds since 1989. And we hear about the amazing problems of currency manipulation. So what's going on? What's actually happening in this dynamic? Is it really the amazing story of radical economic growth and change that produced the outcome of came onto the world stage in the 2008 Olympics? Or is it the pollution debacle and the currency manipulation and the political debacle? Of course, it's somewhere in between. But what I want to argue to you today is that there is a tremendous amount of the negative rhetoric that you see that is driven by fear of China's growth and the fact that we are now welcoming a new equal onto the global economic stage that we cannot deny. And in fact, this country probably has more power and more influence over us than any other country has since the U.S. ascension to power in the 20th century. Now, China has done that very purposefully and strategically, and some might even say aggressively, but they have not done it through military might. They've done it through tethering our economies together so deeply that they have the right to actually make a case for what we should be doing economically. They have the power to influence what we are doing economically. So this is a situation that the United States has not been in before. Some people say, oh, we've seen this before. This is Japan all over again. This is Japan in the 1980s, right? And yes, Japan owned a significant amount of U.S. Treasury bonds, and they owned a significant amount of foreign exchange reserve, but not anything close to what China is sitting on today. And so this relationship between our economies is a very, very interesting one, and it's one that frightens us, to be honest. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got there and how it actually influences some things that we think about today. Because make no mistake about it, it's not just that China has a lot, sits on $2 trillion of treasury bonds and $3 trillion of foreign exchange reserves, and therefore can rattle the cage when they think the U.S. isn't doing the right things economically. It's also that China is actually leapfrogging ahead of us in some economies that are deeply embedded in innovation. Some people will argue, well, Chinese economy, it's a deep, cheap labor pool, and so, yeah, of course they have some advantages, and so things are good. Foxconn builds iPads, and they make a lot of money, and U.S. consumers want them, so yeah, it's all good. But we are still the heart of innovation. And we might be, except we are not building the industries the way that China is, such that if you look 20 years down the road or 30 years down the road, we might not be anywhere close to China. And that, for me, is not just a bullish on China talk. It's actually a fear about the U.S. economy talk. And I fear that the political deadlock in the United States is actually stifling growth in a way that is terrifying. So what I want to talk a little bit about is how this comes to pass. Because in the United States, we have people who say big things. Remember Barack Obama a year ago? He gave his State of the Union speech, and he said, we have big ideas. We do big things. Right? And it was very impressive, and he talked about renewable energy and solar and all of the great things that we're doing. And we do actually produce some of the best technology in this area. But our renewable energy sector is anemic compared to China. China 6 years ago was not even on the map in renewable energy, and now they are number 2 in the world to Germany in production and use of this area. So how is that happening? Well, part of it is because instead of figuring out how to invest in industries, we're focused on China. China is the source of our woes, right? Like, don't you hear that all the time? Like, oh my God, job creation would be great in the United States if China wasn't stealing our jobs, and it's all because of that currency manipulation. Right? Which, by the way, if you walk away from here with one thing, just please remember that currency manipulation is the dumbest debate in the world. The people who talk about currency manipulation being the source of our economic ills are so clueless, or they just think it's the easiest political argument to make and nobody will understand the math of it. It doesn't even make sense mathematically. There's nothing to it. It is not the reason why we have a trade imbalance with China, and it is not the reason why we are losing jobs. We are losing jobs because we are failing to invest in developing industries, right? And even if China wiped away its currency manipulation and the yuan appreciated by 40 or 50%, we still wouldn't get those jobs back. It just wouldn't happen that way. All that would happen is that all of the cheapest goods that come from Walmart, which is the #1 exporter from China to the United States, would be more expensive for the poorest consumers in the United States. There is nothing to the currency debate except for that it will hurt U.S. consumers. So just so we're clear on that one. But there's a bigger issue. What are we doing in terms of investment? Instead of just suing the Chinese government because they are doing unfair labor practices in terms of investing industries, what are we doing to think about that? And so what I want to talk about for the next couple of minutes, I want to kind of take a step back and look at the structure of the Chinese economy from an understanding of what makes this economy strong, and then also look at what we can learn from it in the U.S. economy. It used to be the case when I'd give this talk or a version of this talk in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was more of a talk of why has China been such an economic miracle for a developing country. Today, in the second half of the 2000s, I think the conversation has been much more, what can we actually learn from this economy? And why have we lost our way? And so that's really what I want to focus on right now. Now, typically, if you read any of my books, I have a new edition of China and Globalization that's coming out with Routledge in a couple of months. But in that book, I typically draw on 6 key features that really define the economic reforms in China. I talk about gradualism, decentralization, the openness to foreign investment, governmental strategizing and cross-industry coordination, the balancing of public and private economies, and the quiet revolution of institutions. I'll touch on each of these very, very quickly, and then try to leave enough time for some questions to discuss what it is that might be on your minds. The first thing that has made China an economic juggernaut, gradualism. And what does that mean? In China, there is a term that Deng Xiaoping first uttered in the early 1980s called 摸石过河, or 摸着石头过河. Essentially, it means groping for stones to cross the river. And so it's a beautiful imagery for talking about how economic development happens in China. So you can imagine what the imagery is, right? So over on the other riverbank is your goal, right? That's like the goal of, I don't know, world dominance, the largest economy in the world, whatever it is. But how you get across this river doesn't depend on having a clearly defined economic strategy. Instead, it has defined a line to get over there, but then a careful understanding of where each rock is and how I'm going to feel the stability of that rock and take the next step, right? Now, that's very profound because that's a very different way of developing economic planning than happens in the West and primarily in the United States. In the United States, economic theory has a much more top-down effect on economic planning. Basically, our most valued and prized economists, people that date back to Milton Friedman and his emergence in power in the 1970s and 1980s, they work from theoretical mathematical models, right? Theoretical math is really what defines it, and then you say, this is how an economy works, right? We know that government involvement in an economy is fundamentally efficient because the theoretical math tells us. We know that people are rational, profit-maximizing individuals because that's what's assumed in our models, right? And let's then build an economy that fits with that. Now, what's the risk there? The risk is the kind of mortgage-backed security crisis that cost the world $13 trillion in market capitalization wealth 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Right? If you build your models solely on theoretical mathematical modeling and assume that markets are efficient and individuals are rational profit-maximizing actors, you are inviting the kind of chaos that this global economy has experienced, right? And so it's a very, very dangerous game that we play. It's not one without consequences. However, if you build your models based on the ideas that markets are very complex and we need to strategize step by step, keep our eye on the prize across the way, but think gradually about how we will build the institutions of a market economy. It's a very, very different mindset, and it's very powerful. That has been the approach that China has taken. Now, there's a consequence of this, which we're often very frustrated with, right? People in the human rights community and even in Congress will say, why isn't China reforming its institutions? They should become a democracy. Stop the dickering around already. They should just be it. But the perspective in China is that this is a gradual process. We are gradually evolving our market institutions and the political institutions alongside. And I'll talk in a few minutes about the gradual evolution of political institutions, but that is happening as well. But the key thing to understand here is that gradualism brings about experimentation, which is very, very powerful for the market. The second thing, and this is, one of the things that I often have become known for saying, is that the secret sauce of China's reforms is decentralization. It's a thing that most people who don't understand China very well don't know, but even business people who've been doing business in China haven't thought deeply enough about. We often think that the cornerstone of a capitalist system or of a market economy is privatization, right? You hear this all the time. State ownership cannot be efficient. But we also know of plenty of examples of private firms that are very inefficient, right? Think about GM and Chrysler. Amazingly, GM and Chrysler have become more efficient, or more profitable at least, with the government bailout, right? Government ownership has changed that, right? So we know that that's not quite right. But the problem is that economics has it wrong. It's not private ownership that matters, it's competition. And you can have competition amongst state-owned firms and competition amongst capitalist firms, but anytime you eliminate competition, you're in for trouble. Right? So how did China do that? How did they get success economically without privatization? They got it through maintaining state ownership, but through decentralizing everything down to the local levels. Right? So in China, you have literally millions of fiefdoms of state officials who own a lot of control over industry, but they're all in competition with each other. And they're all in competition with each other for the two holy grails. One, of production contracts from foreign firms that are exporting to the rest of the global economy, and two, for investment from foreign firms that are developing a new industrial economy within China, right? And so they're in fierce competition. Every region has its own juggernaut, right? In Jiangsu, it's Suzhou, and now increasingly it's Wuxi. There's Xi'an, there's Dalian, there's Chengdu. These are mostly places that people in the United States don't know of, but these are the places that are driving development in the Chinese economy. Second-tier cities are where all the action is. But the key point is that decentralization has been at the heart of economic reform in China. And so if you're spending time in China and thinking about business opportunities and wanting to impress somebody in an interview, get to know the second-tier cities. If you're just going to China and spending time in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, you're not really getting to know the real China. The real China is off of that path. Now, just to give you a little bit of a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about the fact that there are, maybe not millions, but there's literally thousands of these kinds of decentralized cities that really matter. In the United States, our cities with population over 1 million are a handful. In China, the number is quite different. Right? So all of these places have the potential to become economic juggernauts, and most of them are off the typical 5-star beaten path that people spend their time in. Now, if you look empirically at where wealth creation is coming from in China, it's all in the second-tier cities. This is really, really where the action is. So don't miss this opportunity if you're going to spend time in China. One place that I'm very excited about, and I've spent a lot of time studying over the course of my career, is a place called Suzhou, which is about 150 miles west of Shanghai. It's also where GW is going to have a major presence in China. I'm going there with Steve Knapp and President Knapp and Provost Lerman in March to sign a major agreement with the Suzhou government. And so we really believe that this is where the future of China is. Third point, you often hear that Chinese markets are closed to foreign investors. There are some difficulties for foreign investors in China, and it's become worse over the course of the last couple of years. But in general, as a vessel for foreign direct investment, China has been more bullish and open than most countries at similar stages of development. So Chinese markets are pretty open to foreign investors. The problem is that China is very, again, I'll use the word pragmatic. There's very much of what people think of as a quid pro quo. You want to come into the Chinese market? That's fine. But you need to start giving us a timeline for technology transfer so that we can actually understand what you're doing. Looks great on the front end, but pretty soon you're going to be there's going to be competition from Chinese firms who have gotten that IPR, and you're going to be out of the market soon. That's exactly what happened to Motorola from the period of 1988 through 1998, basically. And so that's kind of the game, you know. And the Chinese people don't think that there's anything wrong with that. From the U.S. side, companies worry about that. They also worry about guaranteed procurement for state-owned enterprises, and all of those things are concerns. But don't be overtaken by the view that China has closed markets. Actually, the China foreign direct investment is a huge part of the Chinese market. Now, the interesting thing about this, though, is that this is where we often think that China is stealing our jobs, right? So there's, on the one hand, people think, well, Chinese markets are closed. On the other hand, there's a strange kind of irony, because it's actually our markets that aren't very supportive of business. All right, so I'm going to tell you two quick stories to go back to our renewable energy meme that we were just talking about. Why is China surging ahead in renewable energy? We actually have some of the best technology. Germany's technology is as good, maybe better, but a lot of the technology for renewable energy, photovoltaic arrays and the like, come out of the U.S. Not too long ago, I was having lunch with the former chairman and CEO of DuPont, who I was talking about this issue with, and this is an individual named Chad Holliday, and he said, yeah, you know, when we wanted to build the last photovoltaic array plant that DuPont built, and he was the chairman and CEO of DuPont at the time, he said, I would have loved to have built it in the U.S. But economically, for my shareholders, I just couldn't do it, because once China and Singapore got into the game and started competing with each other, they were just, you know, it wasn't even close in terms of what the deal was that was on the table. And then the economic crisis hit. So they had made a commitment to go with Guangdong province. And they let them do the plant in Guangdong and then the research facility in Hong Kong, which would protect the IPR a little bit more. And then the economic crisis hit. And Chad went to the Chinese and he said, I can't build as big as I thought I was going to be. And they said, why? And he said, well, look at what's happening in the economy. Our finances are not the same. And they said, what would you need? And he said, well, how about guaranteed procurement for a couple of years? And I said, done. No problem. We'll guarantee the procurement price and it's all going to be fine. So he said, okay. Right? It's that kind of approach, that kind of flexibility that matters. Compare that to, say, evergreen solar, which a lot of people have lambasted China about stealing from us because it left Massachusetts and went to set up a factory in Wuhan. Evergreen solar lost 1/7 of its bond issuance, which was issued by Lehman Brothers when the economic crisis hit. Right? So evergreen solar went to the government and said, can you help us? Lehman went under. What are we going to do? And they said, TARP money is not for you. You're not a financial firm. And they said, well, what can we do? And they said, well, go out to a bank. Well, it turned out that the way we passed the TARP legislation didn't require that banks lended the money that they were given. Right? So no federally guaranteed underwriting, no banks that were mandated to lend the money that they were given by the government. What are we going to do? Either we close doors or we go to China and get a better deal. Right? And China gave them a better deal of federally guaranteed loans, procurement prices, and all the things that made them move. Right? So is this a case of China stealing jobs, or is it a case of us not actually thinking how to develop an industry? There's another side of foreign direct investment, which I just like to remind people of, because right now it's we who have the closed economy. We don't have a closed economy in general, but we have a closed economy with respect to China. But it's a particularly ironic thing, because people often think that we're at the end of a cycle of globalization. We've shipped all of this cash out through offshore manufacturing, and now we actually just need to figure out what that means for the reshaping of the economy. Actually, we're just at the midpoint of a cycle, because now China is sitting on $3 trillion of foreign exchange reserves, which it has to move. Right? So that money, ideally, should come back to us in the way of investment. Right? They should buy property. They should invest in real estate. They should invest in factories. They should do deals. But the U.S. government regularly shuts down these deals because we don't want Chinese investment. The most famous case of recent years is Huawei, which we've stopped deals of 3 times. And of course, the argument is always, there's an organization under the White House called CFIUS, which is the group that analyzes things for foreign investment from a securities perspective. And CFIUS is very untransparent. And so when I talk to these guys, I say, well, so tell me, why was the Huawei deal such a... They'll say, I can't tell you. You don't have level 1 security clearance. But believe me, it's bad. I actually know the people at Huawei very, very well. And I also know how often Huawei is misrepresented in the press, even by people in Congress who write about what Huawei is really about. For example, they always talk about Huawei as a state-owned organization, which it's not. They talk about its military ties, which it does not have. They talk about the fact that it refuses to go public so that it can maintain private records. But they don't talk about the fact that Chinese law doesn't allow it to go public because the shareholder ownership is so much broader than Chinese law allows for a publicly traded company. So there's all kinds of things that just get mixed up. Is Huawei a security threat? I don't actually know. But is the representation of Huawei in the United States that stops it from investing in the United States disingenuous? Absolutely. So I would question who has closed borders. There's another thing that's interesting and important for thinking about economic development in the United States and how it compares to China, and that is what I think of as cross-industry strategizing. This is an essential part of developing a healthy economy. You have to coordinate across industries. Unfortunately, markets don't do this very well. Governments do it well, but markets do not. So when you hear people in Congress or in the Senate or anybody in a political race saying, leave the market alone, it will solve the problems, there is no answer for how you get cross-industry strategizing, right? Which is why China is outcompeting us in every emerging market because of the cross-industry strategizing that organizations like the State-Owned Asset Administration and Supervision Commission can do. And you hear this all the time from executives. Second to last thing I'll say is that public-private partnerships are crucial. Public-private partnerships are the ways that economies become healthy and powerful. It's something that you see a lot in China today and less in the United States today. And the irony is that one industry that made our economy strong from 1940 until 2000 was built on public-private partnerships. You might say, what? How can you say that? GM, Ford, Chrysler, these are all private companies, yes. But the oil industry has been subsidized to the tune of $500 million a year to keep oil prices cheap. Roads were all built by public construction processes, as were bridges and everything else that creates the network of infrastructure that has built this industry. Right? And so the irony is that we know how to do this. It's actually what made our economy strong. It's only when we've kind of bought hook, line, and sinker the ideas of neoclassical economic theory that government should have no involvement in an economy that our economy has become weak. The final thing I'll just leave you with is that actually the quiet revolution of institutions has been a powerful force in China. It is absolutely true that China is an authoritarian government. I'm not making a case that it's a democracy. But there are a lot of interesting things that have been happening over the course of the last 30 years that have been building the infrastructure of a democratic society. My prediction is that China will be a democracy probably within 20 years. The question is, when people think that that's not fast enough, and I would ask you this question, is Russia any better off? When Yeltsin stood on top of a tank in 1991 and proclaimed the founding of a democratic Russia, and we hailed them as the great contrast to China because a country had the political will to proclaim the founding of a democracy while these other authoritarian oligarchs in China sat on their hands in Beijing. Yeah, okay, that's a good argument. But without institutions to keep authoritarian power in check, it doesn't mean much. So ask yourself, is Russia any more of a democracy today than China is? And I think the obvious answer is no. And so I think that it's an important thing to just study and think of and school yourself in because it's a very complex set of questions. Now, we're about at 6:40, so I want to take a break here. I can talk. I have more slides on what GW is doing in China, but I'd rather take a step back here and give you guys some time for questions before I have to leave. So what's on your mind? Yes, sir. Please tell me your name when you.
Actually, Gandhi, the president of PSI. I just had a quick question regarding the smaller scale aspects. I know you mentioned some of the larger innovations on an industrial scale, but as an international student, kind of from an entrepreneurial perspective, the United States has kind of been seen as like a secure haven for intellectual property. You kind of see the same thing happening in China right now. Is the situation improving, or how is that environment kind of changing?
So it sounds like there are two parts to your question. One is the support for entrepreneurial action, and the second is the protection of the things that entrepreneurs develop. In both of those cases, China is not as good as the United States, and a couple of years back there was a number of articles in a book written by Tarun Khanna at Harvard Business School about, I think it was called Will India Surpass China or something like that. And his basic argument was that India was a bastion, like a great land for entrepreneurs, whereas China was kind of the land of state-owned enterprises and wasn't so friendly to entrepreneurs. To some extent, that stuff is true. So if you think, for example, about whether or not entrepreneurs can get access to capital at a similar rate that they can in other parts of the world or even relative to state-owned enterprises, the answer is obviously no. The reason there's an entire shadow banking industry in China and the reason it's had debacles in places like Wuxi is because entrepreneurs need access to capital and they can't get it through normal channels. There are a number of other ways that you can think about this. Entrepreneurs are much less powerful in terms of their ability to kind of navigate through and work their ways around regulations and such. And so there's always been kind of a tension-filled relationship with entrepreneurs. Similarly, with the protection of things that entrepreneurs produce, China is nowhere near the United States in terms of intellectual property rights. Now, that said, there is also another side to both of those points when you compare China and the United States. I would say that, for example, yes, it's harder to get access to capital in China, but in China there is a lot less bureaucracy, actually. You think of it as a highly bureaucratic place, but in fact in China there's like a lot of things that you can do until you go far beyond the pale in terms of extending beyond the rule of the law, and then you get in trouble, right? But barring that, there's a lot of latitude to do a lot of different things in China. And in the United States, actually, there are great places for entrepreneurship in the United States, but if you talk, for example, to entrepreneurs who try to operate in the District of Columbia, which is a place that's very concerned about joblessness and economic pain, it's not a very friendly place for entrepreneurs. And so some places are. Again, it's sort of a decentralized story. So Virginia is great for it. D.C. is not. Silicon Valley is great. Other places aren't. And so, you know, I would just say, like, we need to move away from the idea that this is the bastion of entrepreneurship. Definitely more protections in terms of intellectual property. And China is a hard place for entrepreneurs, but there are also great companies that have emerged. Geely, for example, was an entrepreneurial endeavor. So was Haier, and so was Lenovo, which ultimately bought IBM's ThinkPad division. But yeah, it's an interesting issue. Yes, please.
Hi, Guthrie. I'm a graduate of Alpha Kappa Psi from Beijing, China. As you said, in the past 10 to 15 years, China has grown tremendously. But those value creators and strategy makers are all in their late 50s and 60s. So do you think, as us, the younger generation, will grow up in a totally different environment? We're more open, we're more respect disciplines. Do you think we are still able to lead China to keep the growing? And what are some advantages and disadvantages for us to compete with the rest of the world?
You mean from the Chinese perspective?
Yeah, from American people to see the younger generation.
Okay. So I think China is a place of tremendous promise, in part because I don't believe in the market as much as most economists do. I think that you have to have a state-market relationship which strikes a balance. And in fact, China is not the only example of this. I mean, Singapore, which is one of the best places to do business in the world, is also an economy driven like this, as is Taiwan, as are a number of European nations that are doing well, like Germany. If your question is how will China evolve given the kind of sunsetting of the careers of the current generation of leaders, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, right now, I don't know how much you guys follow politics, but I haven't been such a fan of the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao regime. I actually think a lot of the momentum that China has had over the last 20 years, and even the last 10, 5 of the last 10 perhaps, comes from the brilliance of Zhu Rongji. I think Zhu Rongji was the best leader. I mean, Deng Xiaoping had his own moments of brilliance and what he thought about, but Zhu Rongji, I think, was a brilliant economic architect. And I think that this current generation of leaders doesn't have the same economic understanding, nor do they have the same respect from the provinces. And so I think that will be interesting, because it will be interesting to see what Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, how they govern the economy. Now, it's interesting because, and this might be a little bit too much for the kind of political, but the state council is, there's a kind of a battle going on between the princelings and the Communist Youth League. And so, now one of Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang come from each of those sides, and so we don't know what that, maybe that's kind of going to be a political harmony of going forward, but I don't see immediately anybody who's as powerful of an economic mind as Zhu Rongji there right now. And so I don't know. I don't know what the answer is going to be. But I do tend to continue to trust the idea that a state commitment to involvement in an economy is a better economic situation than just throwing it open to the market. I think if you throw things open to the market in the extreme in an underdeveloped place institutionally, you get Russia. And in a well-developed place institutionally, it's better, but you get the United States, which is total political deadlock and a lack of investment in key industrial areas. Yes, please.
The Chinese and the U.S. economy have formed a pattern of each having something of the other. However, there are still plenty of economic and trade frictions between two nations. For example, China has been a member of the WTO for more than 10 years now, and should be regarded as a market economy according to the standard objectives. However, the U.S. refused China's status as market economy. In addition to that, U.S. has imposed anti-dumping and countervailing sanctions to the China's export to U.S. For example, tires, furniture, textiles are all targets of sanctions, one after another. So my question is, what are some of the approaches do you think it could ease the economic and trade frictions between China and U.S.?
First, I would say that we should get a bunch of people in Congress who actually either A, understand economics, or B, like actually read a little bit. I think that this stuff is so stupid. I think that it is on the order of what I just talked about very passionately in terms of currency manipulation. I mean, you don't have to read very far to know that the anti-dumping positions in tires and furniture and steel have hurt the U.S. economy and hurt the U.S. businesses and consumers. Steel, not so much, because there's such massive industries there, but tires for sure. Tires have put companies out of the business. They've passed higher prices on to consumers, and they haven't created any jobs, right? So there are issues we need to talk about with China in terms of a lot of these issues, but we do the same whimsical and haphazard things industry by industry that they do, right? We just don't admit to actually supporting industries. We just do it on the defensive through anti-dumping things that are filed with the WTO. And so I just think it's insane. I think it's just absurd. And I think what we should be looking at is not whether or not China should be viewed as a market economy. We should be studying, wow, what would it mean if we were actually more engaged with our own economy? We haven't had an energy policy in this country since the early 1970s. What does that mean? How can we be good in renewable energy, which many people predict is the next major stage of innovation for countries, and are already seeing Germany and China reap the benefits of that when we won't even have a policy around this. Right? And so I think that that's really the answer. Maybe one more question? Sir.
I'm David Continue, and I just wanted to ask you about what Jill is doing in China and what are the programs that you're doing.
Sure. I'm a big believer in the idea that if you really want to be a part of the global economy as a university, you have to go deep. I think 20 years from now, there are going to be a lot of universities that have exchange programs and study abroad programs and all of the things that facilitate movement around the world, but there are going to be a very small handful of schools that have very, very deep relationships in countries, right? So just to give you an example, everybody has an exchange program that you can access with respect to China. You want to go to China, there are a lot of places that we can facilitate that flow to, right? There are only 4 universities in the world that have Ministry of Education approved independent degree granting status. Those are NYU, Duke, Nottingham, and Liverpool. Right? They are the ones that are actually not just creating those synergies of the flow of our opportunities for the flow of our students over to China, but also educating Chinese students, building a base of education in China. We want to be in that group. Right? I want to be in that group, and I want to pick a couple of places. China won't be the only place, but I want to pick a few. Right? I want to pick maybe India, maybe Brazil, maybe Sub-Saharan Africa, a couple of places that actually can really define our agenda intellectually and pedagogically, and I want to go deep with these places. I can already tell you, in terms of the negotiations that we've done in China, and just kind of walking this through the process with our Office of General Counsel, it has been the most complex international deal that GW has ever done. And so my goal is to take us there. In Suzhou specifically, we will be, right now we're offering a Master's of Finance in the Chinese Master of Finance. That's a version of our specialized Masters of Finance here. We'll offer a Masters of Accountancy that will also be like a 1+1 program. Eventually, we hope to build an entire, initially it was going to be an undergraduate 2+2 system where you'd have 2 years in China and 2 years here. But I actually now would like for it to be a global major in which you do your first year in China, and it could be not just Chinese students, but people from anywhere around the world. Maybe one day, you know, people like you will, instead of coming to GW, you'll decide to do your first year in Suzhou, your second year in Foggy Bottom, your third year in Sao Paulo, and your fourth year in Foggy Bottom. And imagine what kind of understanding of the world you would have with a curriculum that served you for that. And so that's kind of my vision, and China is a major part of that. We are going to be doing much, much more. If you spend time in China, you know, we're actually going to be occupying our headquarters space in Suzhou right along the Dushu Lake. It's still under construction, but we'll be moving in there in August, so please let us know, and we'll get you a tour of the place and host you there. Suzhou is only 28 minutes on the high-speed train from Shanghai, so it's very easy to access, and the most important thing is we're going to have fun. So thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to interacting with you all more. Don't worry if you're not a GWSB student. Please feel free to, is everybody here GWSB or some?
Some are not.
Yeah, so whoever you are, welcome. And just be in touch with us. Thank you.
On behalf of Alpha